August 1944, East Prussia. A group of Wehrmacht staff officers stood over a map of France and did the arithmetic of destruction. The line they were watching was moving too fast to be real. Since the first week of August, an American general named George S. Patton had driven his Third Army 400 miles east of the Normandy beaches. Paris, Chartres, the Marne, places that had taken the German army 6 weeks to reach in 1940 were falling to Americans in a matter of days. But the German officers in that room were not afraid. They were relieved. Because every officer in that room, from field marshal to captain, had been trained on the same iron rule of Prussian military science. The rule of the culminating point. Every army in history had run into it. Napoleon at Moscow, the Kaiser at the Marne, the Wehrmacht itself in the summer of 1941 on the roads to Smolensk. The rule was simple. An army could advance about 150 miles beyond its supply base before it began to starve. After that, the tanks would run out of fuel, the artillery would run out of shells, the men would run out of bread, and the enemy, if he was patient, could stop the advance without firing a shot. Patton was 400 miles beyond his supply base. By the mathematics the German general staff had learned at the Kriegsakademie in Berlin, he was already dead. He just did not know it yet. What they could not know, what nobody in that map room in East Prussia was in a position to know, was that at that very moment, in a requisitioned French chateau near the town of Valognes, 2 American officers were rewriting the rule of the culminating point in longhand on butcher paper. They had 38 hours to do it. What they built in those 38 hours would be called the Red Ball Express, and it would prove that the German officers standing over their map were not wrong about physics. They were wrong about America. To understand what happened in the summer of 1944, you have to understand a truth that most histories skip past. The Allies had defeated themselves. In the spring of 1944, under a plan devised by the scientific advisor Solly Zuckerman and championed by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, the Royal Air Force and the American 8th Air Force had launched what the planners called the Transportation Plan. Waves of heavy bombers systematically attacked the French railway network, marshalling yards, locomotive sheds, bridges, signal boxes. More than 70 railway centres were targeted, and by D-Day, French rail traffic had been cut by more than 60%. The German transport authorities in occupied France reported to Berlin that they could no longer guarantee military movements. The purpose had been to trap the Germans in Normandy, to make it impossible for the Wehrmacht to bring reinforcements to the invasion beaches, and it had worked. It had worked so well that when the German army began to retreat in August, they had no rail lines to retreat on. And when the American army began to pursue them, they had no rail lines to pursue on either. The ports were worse. The great port of Cherbourg had been the first prize of the invasion. American troops had captured it on June 27th. But before the last German garrison surrendered, the harbour's chief engineer had executed one of the most thorough acts of demolition in modern military history. Cranes were dropped into the water, wharves were dynamited, ships were sunk in the channels, the harbour entrance was seeded with mines and booby traps that the U.S. Navy would spend the rest of the summer clearing. By mid-August, Cherbourg was working, but at less than half of its designed capacity. The great Belgian port of Antwerp, the port that could actually solve everything, had been captured intact on September 4th. It was one of the greatest ports in Europe, rivaled only by Rotterdam and Hamburg. It could handle 40,000 tons a day. But the 50-mile estuary of the Scheldt River, the only way in from the sea, was still held by German infantry dug into the polders. No ship could reach Antwerp until that estuary was cleared, and that would not happen until the end of November, which left one option: trucks. And here the arithmetic turned savage. An American armoured division on the move consumed roughly 1,000 tons of supplies every single day. An infantry division, roughly 750 tons. Patton had 12 divisions in the field, advancing on a front 60 miles wide. The Germans, watching all of this, took a certain grim satisfaction in the numbers. Because the Wehrmacht knew something about trucks the Americans, they believed, had not yet learned. They did not have enough of them. Nobody did. In 1944, in the 5th year of the war, the German army was still moving 80% of its and supplies by horse. 750,000 horses, a logistics system that would have looked familiar to a Napoleonic quartermaster. The German generals looked at their maps and calculated that the Americans, whatever their industrial arrogance, would soon discover the same brutal truth. You cannot move an army with machines you do not have, except the Americans did have them. Just under 2 days before the operation launched, in a requisitioned French chateau near Valognes, an officer named Charles Thrasher walked into a conference room and closed the door behind him. Colonel Thrasher was the chief of what the army had confusingly named the Advanced Section of the Communications Zone, ADSEC for short. His job, in plain English, was to move everything the American army needed from the Normandy beaches to whatever field the front lines had reached that morning. And by the 3rd week of August he was failing. Waiting for him in the conference room were 2 men. The first was Lieutenant Colonel Loren Albert Ayers, 37 years old, born in Wisconsin in 1907, a transportation officer with a reputation his men had summed up in a nickname, Little Patton. Ayers did not smile in photographs. He did not tolerate excuses. He had one obsession, and his own men would say it, and every history since would repeat it. He cared about tonnage. The second was Major Gordon K. Gravel, another career transportation officer. Thrasher looked at them and gave them a mission. They had 38 hours to invent an entirely new form of military logistics, something that had never been done, something the manuals did not describe, something that could move 12,000 tons of supplies every single day over roads that were half destroyed, in trucks they mostly did not yet have, driven by men they had not yet found. If they failed, Patton would stop at the Meuse. The Germans would have time to regroup. The war would run into another winter, and then perhaps another year after that. Ayers and Gravel sat down at a table and started to sketch on butcher paper. What they drew looked more like a railway timetable than a military plan. 2 highways, parallel, one way. The northern road for loaded trucks moving east toward the front, the southern road for empty trucks returning west toward the depots. Convoys of 40 vehicles, dispatched at 5-minute intervals, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Average speed 35 miles per hour. No civilian traffic allowed. No stopping for anything except mechanical failure. Military police posted every 50 miles to pull any truck below 25 miles per hour off the road entirely. They gave it a name they borrowed from American railroads. In the freight yards of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, an express shipment that had absolute priority over everything else was marked with a red ball painted on its side. They would paint red balls on the trucks, and on the road signs, and on the maps. They called it the Red Ball Express. The decisive logistics operation of the Western Front was designed in 38 hours by a lieutenant colonel and a major, in longhand, in a French chateau, with the door closed. No general staff study, no planning board, no committee. 2 men in a room. On the morning of August 25, 1944, at a staging area outside Saint-Lô, the first Red Ball convoy formed up. That same morning, 400 miles to the east, French tanks under General Leclerc were rolling into the streets of Paris. General Dietrich von Scholtitz, the German commander of the city, was signing the surrender document that would keep Paris from burning. Every headline in every American newspaper the next morning would be about Paris. Not one would mention Saint-Lô. The first trucks belonged to one of the quartermaster truck companies attached to the Motor Transport Brigade. 2.5-ton GMC CCKWs, nicknamed the Jimmy, a flat-fronted cab, a canvas top, and a cargo bed built to carry 5,000 pounds, which on the Red Ball from the first day would routinely carry 10,000. The men climbing into those cabs were, in the language of the segregated American Army of 1944, colored troops. Roughly 75% of the 23,000 men who would eventually drive the Red Ball Express were African American. They had come from Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, from the south side of Chicago and the tenements of Harlem. Most of them had been drafted straight out of Jim Crow. They had been told, when they were drafted, that they would not be trusted with front-line combat. They would drive trucks. They would load ships. They would dig graves. They would cook. They were being told now that they would keep General George Patton's tank divisions rolling toward Berlin. The paradox in that sentence was so sharp that even the officers who wrote the orders felt uncomfortable putting it in writing. Colonel Ayers did not care. Ayers, whose men called him Little Patton, cared about tonnage. He needed 23,000 drivers, and he needed them now, and the United States Army had, In its rear echelon service units, tens of thousands of black soldiers whose talents it was systematically wasting on laundry duty and mess halls. Heirs took them. At 5 o'clock in the morning on August 25th, the first Jimmy of the first convoy of the Red Ball Express pulled out of Saint-Lô, carrying rations bound for the forward dumps near Chartres. The plan was for the operation to run for 10 days. It would run for 82. By the second week of operation, the road itself had begun to look like something out of a fever dream. If you had stood on a hill outside the town of Alençon at any hour of any day in September of 1944, you would have seen the same thing. 2 ribbons of dust running east and west across the French countryside, unbroken from horizon to horizon. On the northern ribbon, an endless procession of olive drab trucks moving toward the front, headlights blazing in defiance of a blackout doctrine every army in Europe still obeyed. On the southern ribbon, the same trucks coming back empty, running the same speed, in the same direction as death itself, westward, toward the sea, toward the ships, toward another load. The round trip was 380 miles from the beaches to the forward depots at Chartres. Later, as Patton pushed the front eastward, it would grow to 400, then 500, then 700. The rules of the road had been written on butcher paper in a chateau near Valognes, and now they governed the lives of 23,000 men. A convoy dispatched every 5 minutes, 40 vehicles per convoy, 60 yards of spacing between trucks, a distance that was almost never actually maintained, an average speed of 35 miles per hour. Military police stationed at intervals of 50 miles, their orders simple. Anything slower than 25 miles per hour was to be pulled off the road, pushed into a ditch if necessary, and left there. The trucks did not stop. They did not stop for meals. Drivers ate K-rations on the wheel, tearing the wax paper open with their teeth. They did not stop for rest. Drivers slept on the wheel or in the passenger seat while a partner drove. They did not stop for the toilet. They did not stop for the wounded. When a truck broke down, the 2 men in the cab climbed out, waved the next convoy past them, and waited for a mobile maintenance unit to arrive from one of the forward workshops that had been strung along the route like beads on a wire. Then they climbed into another truck and kept going. On the 29th of August, 4 days after the operation launched, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period. That was more freight than the entire German army in France moved in a week. The Germans knew it was happening. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights that still braved the American fighter screen at night could see the headlights from 30,000 feet, a chain of white beads running across northern France. Foreign armies west, the intelligence branch that briefed the Wehrmacht General Staff on Allied strength, began to circulate reports about a supply operation whose scale did not match any category their doctrine recognized. The reports were passed along to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt at OB West headquarters. He was 69 years old, the senior soldier of the Wehrmacht, and he had commanded army groups in Poland, France, and Russia. He had never seen anything like it. He did not have the aircraft to stop it. He did not have the fuel to intercept it. He did not, in the end, have anything to say about it that would have changed a single mile of what was rolling past his intelligence officers. The men on the road did not know any of that. They were too tired to know it. The typical Red Ball driver was between 18 and 28 years old. He had been born, in most cases, in the American South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Some of them had never held a driver's license before the army handed them one. Some of them had never driven anything larger than a farm tractor before they were introduced, in the muddy fields of Normandy, to the 2.5-ton GMC CCKW. They would come to know better than they had ever known any woman. They drove in 2-man teams, 20 hours on, 4 hours off. The 4 hours off did not mean sleep. It meant sitting in the passenger seat while your partner drove, watching the headlights of the truck in front of you burn into your eyes, dreaming with your eyes open. The Army Medical Corps had a solution for this. The pills were called Benzedrine, amphetamine sulfate, 10 milligrams per tablet, issued to drivers as needed, on the theory that a driver who was awake and hallucinating was better than a driver who was asleep. Medical Corps after-action reports from the fall of 1944 record widespread use across the Red Ball route. Drivers who took too many pills for too many days began to see things that were not there. Convoys of ghost trucks in the trees, German infantry crawling in the ditches, their own dead grandmothers standing at the side of the road, waving them past. They kept driving. Approximately 300 drivers died in the 82 days the Red Ball Express operated. Almost none of them were killed by the enemy. They died in head-on collisions with the trucks in the opposite lane, when a driver fell asleep and drifted across the double yellow. They died when overloaded Jimmys rolled on curves the engineers had never designed the trucks to take at speed. They died when engines overheated, ignited the gasoline they were carrying, and turned the cab into an oven that could not be escaped. They died in ditches. They died in French farmyards. They died on the shoulders of roads that had been Roman highways 2,000 years earlier and would still be there 2,000 years after they were forgotten. They were listed on the daily returns as non-battle casualties. None of them received the Purple Heart. Here is the truth that made the Red Ball Express something more than a logistics operation. The men driving those trucks belonged to the same United States Army that had told them, when they were drafted, that they were not fit to fight. The most celebrated white general in the American Army, George S. Patton, who was riding at that moment toward the Meuse with his cavalry gloves and his ivory-handled pistols, and his headlines on every front page in America, was being kept in motion by the labor of soldiers his own army would not trust with a rifle in a front-line trench. The paradox was not accidental, it was policy. In 1944, the United States Army was still segregated by regulation. Black soldiers served in black units, commanded almost entirely by white officers, and were assigned overwhelmingly to what the Army called service and supply. They cooked, they loaded ships, they dug graves, they drove trucks. The commander of the communications zone in Europe was a lieutenant general named John C. H. Lee. He was 57 years old, a devout Episcopalian, and one of the very few senior American commanders of his generation who believed the segregation policy was both wrong and stupid. He would say so in writing more than once. He would be quietly ignored more than once. Colonel Ayres cared about none of this. He had a road to run and tonnage to move, and he needed 23,000 drivers, and the army had them, and the army was wasting them. He took them. By the second week of September, in some units on the road, that ratio had climbed to 9 drivers out of 10. They painted their trucks with the names of their sisters and their mothers and their girlfriends back home. They painted them with slogans they had thought up themselves. Rolling to Berlin, Uncle Sam's Sunday Punch, Detroit Special. Some trucks, according to veterans' accounts collected decades later, carried in white letters across the tailgate a phrase that would puzzle any German prisoner who saw it: Jim Crow's own truck. Nobody who drove those trucks needed the phrase explained. They knew what they were doing. They knew who was watching. They knew what would be waiting for them, if they lived, when they came home to the towns and cities they had left, to Detroit and Birmingham, to Harlem and Baton Rouge, to the sharecropper counties of the Delta and the packing houses of the Midwest. They kept driving anyway. The trucks themselves were the second miracle of the Red Ball Express. The GMC CKW 2.5-ton 6x6, the Jimmy, was the workhorse of the American Army in every theater of the war. General Motors built roughly 560,000 of them between 1941 and 1945. That was more trucks than the entire German army possessed, of all types combined, at the peak of its strength. The Jimmy was not elegant, it was not fast, it was not comfortable, it had no heater worth mentioning, no radio, no power steering, and a top speed on level ground of 45 miles per hour. What it had was a flat-headed 6-cylinder engine that would run on almost anything you poured into the tank, all-wheel drive as standard equipment, and a chassis so overbuilt that overloading it by a factor of 2, which was the daily practice on the Red Ball Express, did not immediately break it. The design specification called for a 5,000-pound cargo load. Red Ball drivers routinely carried 10,000 pounds, some carried more. Colonel Ayres had put out an order early in the operation. Every truck on the road was to run overloaded until the springs broke. The springs broke. They were replaced by mobile ordnance teams working out of workshops that had been established every 50 miles along the route. The army had a philosophy for maintenance in the field that would have astonished any German engineer. When a Wehrmacht mechanic encountered a broken engine, he rebuilt it. When an American mechanic encountered a broken engine, he pulled it out with a crane, dropped a new one in, and sent the truck back on the road. Turnaround time 45 minutes. At the peak of the operation, 30% of the trucks on the Red Ball Express were deadlined on any given day. Broken. Awaiting parts. Cannibalized for the trucks that were still running. The system did not slow down. The reason it did not slow down is the fourth twist in this story, and it is a fact so large that even now, 80 years later, it is difficult to make an American audience believe it. The Red Ball Express consumed, on its worst days, more than 700,000 gallons of gasoline in a 24-hour period. More than 700,000 gallons, every day. Not to move Patton's tanks, not to fuel his artillery, not to run his field hospitals or heat his mess halls or power his radios, to run itself. More than half of the fuel the Red Ball Express delivered from the beaches to the front lines was burned by the trucks that were doing the delivering. The operation was, in the coldest economic sense, eating most of what it was carrying. This was the fact that no German general staff officer trained in the discipline of scarcity could process. The senior officers who saw the intelligence estimates on American fuel consumption reportedly refused, at first, to believe the figures. The numbers, they insisted, could not be correct. No army in history had ever burned that much fuel just to move fuel. They were not wrong about history. They were wrong about the country that was writing the new history in front of them. The next fact was uglier, and it is one the official histories tend to move past quickly. The Red Ball Express was leaking. By the second week of September, the Provost Marshal of the communications zone was receiving reports that the American army had a problem it had not planned for. Gasoline was disappearing off the trucks. Rations were disappearing off the trucks. Cigarettes and chocolate and soap and cases of Spam and drums of aviation fuel were disappearing off the trucks. They were being sold on the streets of Paris and Rheims and Chartres, in a black market that had grown so large by October that the military police were assigning entire companies to the problem. The men doing the stealing were not, in most cases, the black drivers whose faces were on every truck. The reports of the Provost Marshal show what the reports of the Provost Marshal always show, that theft on the Red Ball involved white sergeants and white lieutenants and white supply clerks in warehouses along the route, working with French middlemen and Parisian gangsters who had been running black markets under German occupation and now transferred their skills, seamlessly, to the American army that had liberated them. At the peak of the black market, the army estimated it was losing between 3 and 5% of everything the Red Ball Express carried. 3 to 5% of everything the Red Ball Express carried was still more freight than the German army in France was receiving through all channels combined. That is not a boast, that is a measurement, and it is the fifth twist of this story, because the Red Ball Express was, by the end of September, in the process of destroying itself. The trucks were wearing out. Tire consumption had reached 10,000 tires a week. Engines were being replaced at a rate of 500 per week. The roads themselves were being pounded into gravel by the constant weight of overloaded convoys. French farmers, whose fields ran alongside the route, reported that the vibration from the trucks passing was cracking the walls of their farmhouses. And yet, the Red Ball Express was accelerating. The reason was the thing the German general staff had never truly reckoned with, and the thing that no European army in 1944 had ever competed against. Behind the trucks were the ships. Behind the ships were the ports of New York and Baltimore and New Orleans. Behind the ports were the assembly lines of Detroit and Flint and South Bend and Dearborn. And on those assembly lines, faster than the Red Ball could destroy the trucks it was running, General Motors and Studebaker and Dodge and International Harvester were building new ones. The American economy was producing replacement trucks faster than the Red Ball Express was breaking them. In the first week of September of 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, drove out from his forward headquarters near Granville to see the Red Ball Express for himself. His naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, was with him. Butcher kept a diary. The diary was published after the war, and the entries from that first week of September survive. Eisenhower stood by the side of the northern road for a long time watching the trucks pass. The drivers going by that morning did not know who he was. They saw a stocky man in a rumpled uniform, standing in the mud, one hand shading his eyes against the sun. They kept driving. There was no other choice. Butcher recorded the moment. His general had turned to him, after some time, and had said something quiet. He said the men going past them were winning the war as surely as any infantry division at the front. He said the army was going to have to reconsider a great many things. He did not, in that moment, do anything about it. He was a soldier fighting a war, and the reckoning would wait. But 4 years later, in 1948, when President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 and ordered the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces, the studies that had been commissioned to justify that order would cite, among other operations, the performance of the Red Ball Express. The road was making an argument the American army had spent 170 years refusing to hear. But the road was still running, and Patton, 400 miles to the east, was still moving. For the moment, on the last day of August 1944, the leading elements of Patton's Third Army crossed the Meuse River near the town of Verdun. Verdun. The name meant something to every American in that column who had a father old enough to remember. It was the great charnel house of the First World War, the place where the French army had bled for 10 months in 1916, the place where a generation of Frenchmen had been ground into the mud. The Americans crossed it in a single afternoon. They did not stop. They pushed on toward the German border, which was, at that moment, less than 50 miles east of them. Between them and Germany, there was almost nothing. The Siegfried Line, the great fortified belt of concrete pillboxes and dragon's teeth that Hitler had built along the western border of the Reich in the 1930s, was thinly held. The German army in the west had been shattered in the Falaise pocket 3 weeks earlier. Entire divisions existed only on paper. In some sectors, there were fewer than one German soldier for every 100 yards of front. Patton could see it. Patton, who missed very little that could be seen from the seat of a jeep, understood exactly what was in front of him. He wrote to his wife that week that if he were given the fuel, he could be inside Germany within 10 days. He told his corps commanders that history would never forgive them if they stopped now. By the last days of August, the fuel had begun to run out. On August 28th, General Omar Bradley notified Patton that no more gasoline shipments would arrive until at least September 3rd. The leading spearheads of the 4th Armoured Division, the 7th Armoured Division, the 5th Infantry Division, one by one, over the course of the next week, coasted to a halt on the roads east of the Meuse and sat there, waiting. The engines cooled. The men climbed out and stretched. The tank commanders got on the radio and asked, in language that grew steadily more unprintable, where the fuel trucks were. The fuel trucks were on the Red Ball Express. And the Red Ball Express, for all the miracles it was performing on the road, could not close the distance. The round trip was now over 700 miles. Each truck was consuming more fuel than it was delivering to any single tank at the front. And the fuel that was reaching the front was being rationed by a decision made not by Colonel Ayres in his chateau, and not by the drivers on the road, but by General Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters. Eisenhower had chosen, in the first week of September, to give priority in fuel to the British 21st Army Group in the north. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had convinced him that a single powerful thrust across the Rhine at Arnhem, the operation that would come to be known as Market Garden, could end the war before Christmas. Patton was ordered to stop. This is the 6th twist in the story of the Red Ball Express, and it is a hard one to tell in a way that does not sound like an accusation. The Red Ball Express did not fail Patton. The Red Ball Express did everything a logistics operation could physically do in the autumn of 1944. It moved more freight, faster, over longer distances, in worse conditions than any comparable operation in the history of warfare up to that point. The men on that road drove themselves into hallucinations. They died in ditches without a Purple Heart. And it was still not enough, because no truck operation, however brilliantly conceived, could substitute forever for what the Allies actually needed. What the Allies actually needed was the port of Antwerp, and Antwerp would not open until the Canadians and the British had spent 2 months of savage fighting to clear the Scheldt estuary, an operation that would not be completed until the 8th of November, and would not deliver the first Allied ship to the Antwerp docks until the 28th. The Red Ball Express was a bridge. It was never designed to be a highway. It held the American army together for 82 days while the war waited for a harbour. And during those 82 days, in the villages of eastern France where Patton's tank sat cold on the roads, German infantry commanders looked west with something that was not yet hope, but was no longer despair. They had been given a gift they had not expected. They had been given time. They used it. By the middle of October, the Wehrmacht in the west was rebuilding. Reserves were coming forward. New Volksgrenadier divisions were being formed from the remnants of the Falaise disaster and stiffened with veterans pulled out of the Eastern Front. In the wooded hills of the Eifel and the Ardennes, an army group that officially did not exist was being quietly assembled, in radio silence, out of sight of Allied reconnaissance. That army group would attack, in the snow, 3 days before Christmas. The Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive of the war, was born in the fuel shortage of September. It was born in the miles the Red Ball Express could not close. It was born in the gap between what American industry could do and what American physics still could not. The Red Ball Express itself began to wind down in October. The reason was mercy, though nobody in ADSEC would have used the word. American railway engineers, working in shifts around the clock, had been rebuilding the French rail network faster than the Germans had destroyed it. Rail lines began to reach Paris in September. They reached Reims by the end of the month. They reached the German border by the end of October. And every mile of rail that came back into service was a mile the trucks did not have to run. New route systems replaced the original Red Ball. There was the White Ball Express, running from Rouen to the front. There was the Green Diamond route from Cherbourg to the railheads. There was the ABC Hall, running from Antwerp once the port finally opened, up through Brussels toward the German frontier. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued. There was no ceremony, there was no parade. The last convoy simply rolled into its terminus. The last drivers climbed down out of their cabs, and the operation dissolved back into the ordinary business of the American Army in Europe. Colonel Ayres, whose men called him Little Patton, would receive the Legion of Merit. He would live until 1994, retire as a full colonel, and be buried in Wisconsin. The final numbers, when the Quartermaster Corps compiled them, were these: 82 days of operation, 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 5,958 trucks on the road at any given moment, 23,000 drivers in the rotation, more than 100 million ton-miles of freight moved, and, according to the Provost Marshal's estimate, approximately 300 drivers dead. Almost all of them were black. Almost none of them received a citation for combat valor. They had not, in the categories the Army used, been in combat. The trucks that had survived the Red Ball Express were, in most cases, mechanically finished. Engines had been rebuilt 3 and 4 times. Frames were bent. Suspensions were shot. Many of them were driven directly to salvage depots and cut up for scrap. Others were left where they had broken down, along the shoulders of French roads, gradually stripped of their tires and their batteries and their radiators by farmers who understood, as farmers always do, that a broken machine is a resource that has not yet been claimed. The men climbed onto trains and troop ships and went home. They went home to Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. They went home to Chicago and Detroit and Harlem. They went home to a country that had not desegregated its restaurants, its schools, its public swimming pools, or its cemeteries. In some of the small southern towns those men returned to, veterans in uniform were beaten on the street corners by white police officers for the crime of being in uniform. They did not talk much, in the years that followed, about the road. Their sons and their grandsons would sometimes ask them. Some of them would say a little. Most of them would say nothing. What would you have said? What word would you have used to a grandchild in a segregated schoolyard in 1952 for what you had done on the road to Chartres in 1944? Here is the 7th and last twist in the story of the Red Ball Express. The road did not go to waste. In 1946, an army board convened to study the performance of black troops in the European theatre. It was chaired by Lieutenant General Alvin Gillum, and it became known to history as the Gillum Board. Its final report ran to hundreds of pages, and it drew on the operational records of dozens of units. But the case it made in the end was not complicated. It said that African American soldiers, given equipment and mission and leadership, had performed at levels indistinguishable from their white counterparts across the whole of the European theatre. It said that the segregation policy had cost the United States Army capacity it could not afford to waste. It said that a modern industrial army could not, in a future war, sustain the inefficiencies of racial separation. Among the operations the Guillem Board studied was the Red Ball Express. The report was submitted in 1946. It was for 2 years quietly filed. But in 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 and ordered the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces, the studies that were cited in support of that order included, by name, the record of the Red Ball Express. The road had made an argument that 170 years of American history had not been willing to hear, and the argument had won. Not all at once, not cleanly. The desegregation of the American military took years, and the desegregation of American civilian life took decades. And both are, in ways every viewer of this program will recognize, still contested to this day. But something changed in 1948 that had not been imaginable in 1944, and the men who had driven the trucks, the men who had died in ditches without a Purple Heart, the men who had come home to Alabama and Mississippi and been beaten in their uniforms, those men had made the change possible. They were not told this. Most of them died without knowing it. When historians began, in the 1990s, to reconstruct the story of the Red Ball Express and to interview the surviving drivers, the men were in their 70s and 80s. Many of them were surprised that anyone had come to ask. On the German side, the reckoning was quieter. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, lived until 1978. He wrote a good deal in his later years about what he had learned in the West in 1944. He wrote that the American army had mechanized warfare beyond anything the German General Staff had imagined possible. The Wehrmacht, he acknowledged, had gone to war in 1939 still dependent on horses, and had ended the war in 1945 in the same condition. That gap between what Germany could build and what America could build was the entire difference between the world that was ending and the world that was coming. He did not name the Red Ball Express in what he wrote. He did not need to. Every German commander in the West that autumn had understood what was moving on the roads to their south and west. It was not a supply operation. It was a demonstration. The demonstration was that America had built a civilization capable of solving a logistics problem the Prussian General Staff had not been able to solve in 150 years, and that America had solved it in the summer of 1944 with tools the Prussian General Staff had refused to touch. Trucks, assembly lines, interstate highways that did not yet exist, but were already implied by the men who had driven the roads to Chartres and would come home and build them, and black soldiers whom the Prussian General Staff, in the racial categories of the Third Reich, had been told were biologically incapable of complex mechanized tasks. The demonstration was final. The Wehrmacht never recovered from it. If you were to drive today, in the summer of any recent year, along the old route of the Red Ball Express, from Cherbourg to Saint-Lô, from Saint-Lô to Chartres, from Chartres east toward Verdun and the Meuse, you would find very little that remains of the operation. The road is a modern French highway now. The convoys are gone. The mobile workshops are gone. The military police checkpoints are gone. The men who drove the trucks are almost all dead. But if you know where to look, in the ditches beside certain rural roads in Normandy, you can still find pieces of metal that once belonged to a 2.5-ton GMC, a leaf spring, a brake drum. Once in a while, a piece of a fender with the ghost of a red circle still visible under the rust. They are not memorials. Nobody put them there on purpose. They are the residue of a passage, the traces left by an army that was moving too fast to stop, and by the men who were driving it faster than any army had moved before. The German generals who had laughed at American logistics in August of 1944 did not, in the end, live to see all of what they had underestimated. But the trucks kept rolling, and the road, in the way of roads, remembered.